As you watch this right now, there may be someone who deeply wounded you who seems to be living as though nothing ever happened. This person may have lied to you, manipulated your emotions, distorted reality, and eventually walked away carrying themselves like they had somehow won. You may have spent countless moments wondering when life would finally hold them accountable. Maybe you have checked their social media, heard stories through mutual connections, or noticed that they appear happier than ever. A new relationship, a better position, new friends, confident photographs, and that familiar expression of complete control can make it seem as though they escaped every consequence. You may quietly ask yourself why they were allowed to hurt you and continue moving forward. But what appears to be victory from the outside can conceal something entirely different happening beneath the surface. The uncomfortable truth is that people who repeatedly manipulate, deceive, and exploit others do not simply escape the consequences of their behavior because nobody immediately exposes them. Their consequences often develop internally and gradually, hidden behind the image they carefully maintain. What looks like confidence can actually require enormous psychological effort to sustain. What appears to be freedom may depend on constant distraction, validation, control, and performance. They may surround themselves with new people, create new stories, and construct another version of themselves, but none of that automatically changes the internal patterns that created the original damage. The moment they believe they have successfully escaped accountability, they may actually become more dependent on the very mechanisms that keep them trapped. Their greatest problem is not what happens to them externally. It is that they cannot permanently escape themselves. Many people imagine karma as some dramatic event that arrives from nowhere. They picture a sudden collapse, financial disaster, public exposure, or humiliating downfall that finally makes everything feel fair. But consequences in human psychology rarely operate like a movie scene. They are often much quieter and much more structural. A person's repeated patterns eventually shape the world they live inside. If someone consistently destroys trust, they eventually struggle to experience genuine trust. If they manipulate every relationship, authentic intimacy becomes difficult. If they constantly protect themselves from responsibility, self-reflection becomes threatening. Their behavior creates an environment that eventually reflects their own internal structure. That is, the deeper form of consequence. Nobody needs to summon it, manufacture it, or chase it down. The patterns themselves keep producing the results. The person becomes trapped inside the very system they spent years building. In the moments ahead, we are going to examine the psychological process behind that hidden deterioration and the warning signs that can reveal when the process has already begun. There are subtle changes in behavior, communication, emotional reactions, and even the way someone presents themselves when their carefully maintained identity begins becoming difficult to sustain. These details are easy to overlook because they rarely look dramatic at first. A slight change in their confidence, an unusual defensiveness, an increased need for admiration, or a sudden shift in how they talk about other people can reveal far more than a polished social media profile ever could. Understanding these patterns can help you stop interpreting their apparent success as proof that they escaped consequences. Sometimes the collapse begins long before anyone on the outside can recognize it. There is another reason this matters for you. If you remain focused on whether the person who hurt you will eventually suffer, part of your emotional life can remain tied to them. You continue checking, wondering, comparing, waiting, and searching for evidence that justice has finally arrived. Their life remains psychologically connected to yours even when they are physically absent. But understanding how these patterns actually work can change that perspective. You begin realizing that you do not need to organize their downfall, monitor their relationships, or wait for some spectacular moment of punishment. Their behavior already contains its own consequences. Your responsibility is not to make them understand what they did. Your responsibility is to stop allowing their choices to determine your emotional state. Once you see the mechanism clearly, their apparent victory begins to lose its power over you. There is often a point where a person's psychological defenses become so complicated that maintaining them requires more energy than simply facing reality would require. Imagine a situation where every explanation must protect another explanation. Every contradiction requires another excuse, and every uncomfortable truth has to be pushed somewhere else. Eventually, the person is no longer simply telling individual lies. They are maintaining an entire internal structure designed to prevent certain truths from reaching consciousness. From the outside, they may appear composed and completely certain of themselves. Internally, however, there can be increasing tension between what they know, what they claim, and what they need everyone else to believe. The more complicated the performance becomes, the more difficult it is to relax inside it. The mask that once protected them can gradually become something they are forced to defend every day. When you encounter a highly self-protective and manipulative personality, it can seem as though they possess an unusual immunity to consequences. They move quickly from one relationship to another, collect new sources of attention, and appear completely unaffected by the people they have discarded. They may replace friendships, partners, workplaces, or social circles with surprising speed. Because you are watching them move forward while you are still processing what happened, it can feel deeply unfair. But speed does not necessarily equal healing, and replacement does not necessarily equal resolution. A person can change their surroundings without changing their psychological patterns. If the same internal mechanisms travel with them into every new environment, then the scenery changes while the underlying story remains exactly the same. Healthy human relationships normally contain a natural feedback system. When someone receives affection, they experience connection. When they hurt another person, they can experience remorse. When they make a mistake, they can recognize it, repair the damage, and modify their behavior. These responses allow people to learn from experience and maintain healthier relationships over time. But when someone repeatedly avoids accountability, suppresses guilt, externalizes blame, or protects a fragile self-image at all costs, that feedback system becomes distorted. Instead of learning from consequences, they may reinterpret them as attacks. Instead of asking what they did wrong, they may focus on who supposedly caused their problems. Instead of repairing damage, they may search for another person to replace the one who left. This is where the psychological cost of maintaining a false identity becomes important. When someone cannot tolerate seeing themselves as flawed, ordinary, rejected, responsible, or imperfect, they may construct a version of themselves that feels superior, powerful, desirable, or untouchable. That image can become extremely important to their emotional survival. The problem is that reality constantly produces information that contradicts it. People leave. Relationships fail. Promises become impossible to maintain. Others eventually notice inconsistencies. Mistakes happen. Rejection occurs. Aging continues. Life refuses to cooperate with the fantasy of complete control. Each contradiction creates pressure. The stronger their need to preserve the constructed identity, the more energy they must spend denying, explaining, redirecting, or controlling anything that threatens it. Over time, the mask becomes less like protection and more like a psychological prison. This constructed identity has to appear flawless, exceptional, and superior, while also allowing them to become the victim whenever that position benefits them. But maintaining such an image requires an almost endless stream of outside reinforcement. Imagine an enormous inflatable structure that only remains standing because a pump constantly pushes air into it. The moment the pump stops, the entire structure loses its shape and collapses. That is what constant validation can become for a fragile identity. Every interaction starts carrying a hidden question. How am I being perceived? Do I have the upper hand? Are they impressed? Can they see through me? Instead of simply participating in a relationship, they may be continuously monitoring the situation and adjusting their behavior to protect the image they need others to believe. That constant internal monitoring can become exhausting because the performance never truly ends. While another person may simply talk, connect, feel emotions, make mistakes, and move naturally through a relationship, Someone heavily dependent on narcissistic defenses may be performing an entirely different mental process underneath. They are watching reactions, measuring approval, anticipating criticism, protecting their status, and deciding which version of themselves will produce the response they want. The interaction becomes less about genuine connection and more about managing perception. This is where the deeper consequence begins to emerge. A false identity can only survive as long as enough people continue reinforcing it. But people change, circumstances change, and eventually the strategies that once produced admiration may become less effective. The person who depended on constant external validation can then experience something extremely uncomfortable. The world is no longer supplying the same amount of reinforcement that their identity requires. As time passes, the available sources of validation can also become harder to maintain. Charm that once worked effortlessly may begin producing weaker reactions. Social environments change. People become more experienced and less impressed by familiar manipulation tactics. Former friends may create distance, previous partners may stop responding, and new people may recognize patterns much sooner than earlier targets did. At the same time, years of unresolved behavior begin accumulating consequences. Every deception requires a version of events to remember. Every contradiction has to be explained. Every accusation has to fit into the larger story. Every person who knows something uncomfortable becomes a potential threat to the carefully maintained narrative. After years of repeating this process, the internal world can become increasingly complicated. Instead of one stable reality, there may be countless competing explanations that must constantly be maintained. That complexity can create a persistent background level of suspicion. If someone has spent years manipulating people, they may begin assuming that others are manipulating them too. If they have repeatedly betrayed trust, they may become unusually concerned about betrayal from everyone around them. The world begins to look dangerous because their own behavior has taught them to expect hidden motives. A casual conversation can feel like an investigation. A delayed message can become suspicious. A change in someone's tone can be interpreted as evidence that something is happening behind their back. This does not necessarily mean they consciously understand where the fear comes from. Much of it can operate beneath awareness. The important point is that a person can appear extremely confident while simultaneously living with a deep need to monitor what others know, what others think, and whether their carefully constructed image is beginning to weaken. The quiet moments can become especially revealing. When there is no audience, no social performance, no incoming attention, and no one available to reassure them, whatever has been suppressed can become much harder to avoid. This is why constant stimulation can become so important. New conversations, new relationships, notifications, social activity, compliments, conflict, and even drama can provide enough emotional noise to prevent uncomfortable feelings from becoming fully noticeable. When everything finally becomes silent, however, the distractions disappear. The person is left with their own thoughts and emotional patterns. If those inner experiences are dominated by insecurity, shame, emptiness, resentment, or fear of inadequacy, solitude can feel threatening rather than peaceful. The problem is not necessarily that they have nobody around them. The deeper problem is that being alone removes the external material they use to avoid confronting themselves. This can help explain why some people move rapidly from one relationship or social connection to another. It is tempting to interpret their constant attention from others as proof that they are thriving or irresistibly desirable. But attention and intimacy are not the same thing. Someone can have an endless supply of people around them while remaining profoundly disconnected from genuine emotional closeness. A new relationship may provide excitement, validation, reassurance, and distraction, but those things do not automatically resolve the underlying emptiness. If the relationship is being used primarily to regulate self-worth, then once the initial validation weakens, another source may be needed. The cycle continues. New person, new attention, new excitement, new image, followed by the same internal discomfort returning when the external stimulation no longer works as strongly. That is why the most meaningful consequence is not necessarily a dramatic public downfall. It can be the gradual recognition that external acquisition cannot permanently repair an internal wound. More attention cannot create genuine self-worth when the person does not believe they possess it. More admirers cannot guarantee lasting security. More relationships cannot automatically produce emotional intimacy. More control cannot eliminate uncertainty. A person can collect achievements, possessions, followers, partners, and social influence while still carrying the same unresolved internal conflict from one environment to the next. Eventually, the pattern becomes visible through repetition. The scenery changes, but the emotional outcome remains remarkably similar. The deeper isolation becomes visible when the person has surrounded themselves with people, but still cannot experience authentic safety with them. Trust becomes difficult because vulnerability threatens the image they are protecting. Intimacy becomes dangerous because genuine closeness allows another person to notice inconsistencies that casual relationships may never see. Over time, people may remain physically present while becoming emotionally distant. Conversations become performative, connections become transactional, relationships become centered on what each person provides rather than what they genuinely share. This is the isolation paradigm, not necessarily being physically alone, but being unable to create the kind of honest emotional connection that makes solitude unnecessary as an escape. A crowded room can still feel empty when nobody is allowed to see the person behind the performance. Most people misunderstand this because they are waiting for an external punishment. They expect the dramatic bankruptcy, the ruined reputation, the courtroom confrontation, or the public apology that finally confirms everything they experienced was real. But psychological consequences often begin much earlier and remain invisible to outsiders. The deeper collapse can occur inside the person's emotional and behavioral system before anyone else notices anything unusual. To understand that process, you have to look beyond appearances and examine what supports the personality structure underneath them. A psychologically healthy identity generally develops through self-awareness, genuine relationships, personal values, accountability, and the ability to recognize both strengths and weaknesses. Those internal foundations provide stability when circumstances change. But when identity depends heavily on image, admiration, control, and superiority, external disruption can become far more destabilizing. A person who has built their identity around being exceptional or untouchable may have difficulty tolerating ordinary human limitations. Failure can feel like humiliation. Rejection can feel like an attack on their entire identity. Criticism can feel unbearable rather than informative. Instead of adapting to reality, they may attempt to reshape reality through denial, blame, manipulation, or control. This is where the trap becomes increasingly restrictive. The false identity is supposed to protect them from painful feelings, yet protecting it requires constant effort. Every threat has to be neutralized. Every contradiction has to be explained. Every person who challenges the narrative has to be dismissed, attacked, replaced, or avoided. What initially functioned as psychological protection can eventually become an exhausting system that demands attention every hour of the day. The small signals can become especially interesting when that system begins losing efficiency. It may not look like a dramatic breakdown. Sometimes it appears as a brief pause before responding, an unusually sharp reaction to an ordinary comment, a smile that arrives slightly too late, or visible tension when control over a conversation suddenly disappears. A person may become noticeably irritated by small inconveniences that previously would not have bothered them. Their tone may change when someone questions their version of events. They may become more defensive when attention shifts away from them. These signs should not be treated as proof of a specific diagnosis because individual behaviors can have many explanations. But patterns of increasing defensiveness, rigidity, suspicion, and emotional reactivity can reveal that maintaining the preferred image is becoming more difficult. The important signal is not one isolated expression. It is the repeated pattern beneath it. At this stage, they may no longer be functioning through careful strategy as much as they once appeared to be. Instead, their behavior can become increasingly driven by internal tension, fear, and the need to protect themselves. From the outside, everything may still look perfect. They can upload polished photographs, enter new relationships, collect attention, and walk into social situations with the confidence of someone who believes they control the entire room. But appearances do not necessarily reveal what is happening internally. If a person's identity depends heavily on control, admiration, and managing how others perceive them, maintaining that image can become exhausting. The quieter moments may become especially uncomfortable because there is no audience to impress and no external validation to hide behind. The consequence is not necessarily some dramatic event waiting in the future. It can already exist in the constant tension created by living against reality. A person can become trapped inside patterns of suspicion and self-protection without anyone around them realizing how much internal effort is being spent maintaining those patterns. They may struggle to relax because relaxation requires a sense of safety. And safety becomes difficult when everyone is viewed through a lens of potential betrayal. They may question motives, interpret ordinary behavior as disrespect, or constantly look for signs that someone is losing admiration for them. Even moments that should feel peaceful can become opportunities for analysis. This is one reason external appearances can be so misleading. Someone may look successful while privately experiencing a very different emotional reality, and you do not need to investigate their life to prove it. The healthiest response is not to wait for their suffering or create circumstances designed to punish them. Your freedom begins when their consequences stop being something you need to witness. The moment someone repeatedly chooses deception as a way of managing relationships, they also create a world where honesty becomes increasingly difficult to trust. They begin living with the consequences of their own operating system. This does not mean every difficult emotion or stressful experience is some supernatural punishment. It means repeated behavior shapes expectations, relationships, and emotional habits. If someone constantly assumes others are lying, they may struggle to believe sincere people. If they manipulate others, they may expect manipulation in return. If they use affection strategically, genuine affection may feel suspicious. Eventually, the very strategies they use for protection can prevent them from experiencing the safety they claim to want. That is the deeper irony. They may spend years trying to control every variable around them, only to discover that control itself has become a source of constant tension. The prison is not necessarily visible. It exists inside the way they interpret the world. Even when nothing dangerous is happening, the internal alarm system remains active. The tragedy is that the person may become increasingly isolated, not because nobody is available, but because their own interpretation of relationships makes genuine trust increasingly difficult. That leads directly into the isolation pattern. Someone may spend years trying to create a network of people who admire them, obey them, depend on them, or provide emotional validation. They may demand loyalty and attempt to control the environment around them. Yet relationships built primarily around fear, obligation, admiration, or usefulness cannot provide the same emotional foundation as genuine intimacy. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires admitting mistakes, tolerating imperfection, allowing another person to disagree, and being seen without constantly managing the image. For someone who experiences vulnerability as dangerous, those requirements can trigger powerful defenses. Instead of becoming more emotionally open as a relationship deepens, they may become more controlling, distant, critical, or manipulative. The relationship becomes less safe precisely when it becomes more intimate. To maintain that control, they may use tactics that gradually destroy the relationship itself. They might distort another person's perception of events, minimize their feelings, compare them with others, create jealousy, withdraw affection, or repeatedly violate small boundaries. These behaviors can produce temporary compliance, but they also weaken trust. And trust is one of the most important foundations of lasting connection. Once trust repeatedly disappears, emotionally healthy people often begin creating distance. They may stop explaining themselves, stop arguing, and eventually stop participating altogether. This can leave the person who relied on control searching for new relationships to replace the ones that became exhausted. The cycle repeats. New connection, initial idealization, increasing control, emotional erosion, conflict, withdrawal, replacement. Eventually, maintaining the same pattern becomes more difficult because previous relationships have left a trail of people who now recognize the behavior. This is why the social environment can gradually change. People with strong boundaries may leave early. People who value mutual respect may refuse to remain in relationships where manipulation is constant. Others may stay longer, but eventually become emotionally depleted. Over time, the person may find themselves surrounded by connections that are either superficial, highly conditional, or dependent on maintaining a certain image. That can create a strange contradiction. Someone may appear socially connected while experiencing very little genuine intimacy. They can have family members, coworkers, followers, acquaintances, or romantic partners around them and still feel fundamentally unseen. The problem is that authentic connection requires showing something real. If every vulnerable part is hidden behind performance, then even the people who remain close may only know the character being presented. The room can be full, yet the person can still experience profound emotional distance. There is a subtle behavioral shift that can reveal when this pattern is becoming increasingly unstable. But it is important not to treat one expression or gesture as definitive proof of anything. Human facial expressions and speech patterns vary for countless reasons. Still, when someone is under significant psychological pressure, the coordination between what they say and how they express themselves can sometimes become less natural. Their words may claim confidence while their body shows tension. Their smile may appear forced during a moment that should produce warmth. Their response may become unusually delayed when confronted with something unexpected. Their tone may become rigid while they insist they are completely calm. The useful observation is not one isolated signal, but the consistency of the mismatch. When words repeatedly communicate one reality while behavior communicates another, the contradiction itself becomes meaningful. As internal pressure increases, conversational patterns can also change. Someone who previously relied on smooth persuasion may suddenly become repetitive when their usual tactics stop working. Instead of answering a simple question directly, they may return again and again to the same justification. Minor details can become disproportionately important because focusing on them allows the larger issue to remain untouched. Their speech may become faster, sharper, or more defensive. They may repeatedly insist that everyone else is misunderstanding them while offering increasingly complicated explanations. This does not necessarily mean they are experiencing some irreversible neurological collapse. It can simply indicate that the person's normal emotional regulation is under strain. When a familiar strategy stops producing the desired response, frustration can replace confidence, and the carefully maintained presentation can become much harder to sustain.